black storm coming. See the lightning strike. Black people rising.
White people did not exist before 1681. Again, white people did not exist on planet Earth until 1681. Number two, any claim that this group called white people, any claim that that group is rooted in biology or derived from genes or biology or is innate or is from nature is a lie. Third and final point, as a matter of foundational law, actually let me say it this way, white supremacy has been embedded in the United States of America from its founding as a matter of law. Now, I don't expect you to buy all that, to get all that, to believe all that, at least not now. But my job is to share with you the legal history that proves each of those three claims that I begin with. So let's go. Let's get started. We have to begin this conversation in colonial North America, specifically in the colonies, the British colonies of Maryland and Virginia. Both were British colonies, and both shared a number of particular characteristics. First, their economies were rooted in tobacco farming. If you know much about tobacco farming, it requires tremendous human labor, lots and lots of workers. So those who owned large plantations, big landholders, constantly needed laborers to do the work to grow the tobacco. In addition to sharing an economic base, both colonies had an incredible gender imbalance, roughly 10 men for every woman. Now, let's understand a little bit about the folks who constitute the people in these two colonies. Oh, and by the way, let me give you a year. We're in the early 1600s, okay? The early part of the 17th century, colonial North America. England had, for some bizarre reason that today demographers cannot explain, there was a population boom in England in the early 17th century. So there were lots and lots of poor British people who were on the public doles, who couldn't find a way to make a living, who couldn't feed themselves. So the king in England was quite happy to have them sign a contract of indenture to then go work in the British colonies. And that is what happened. Both indentured and enslaved persons, according to historian Edmund Morgan, were sold and traded like cattle. But of course, not all laborers stand equal in terms of their labor agreement or lack thereof. Those who came under a term of indenture worked for a term of years, and presumably this indenture was an agreement that they chose to enter into. The terms of indenture were largely protected by British law, although the terms that took form in colonial North America were quite different than those that existed in England. For example, in England, indentured servants could marry because that was viewed as the way to produce the next group of workers.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Umoja Circle. My name is Keith Smokey Johnson, and for those of you who are new to the show, the Umoja Circle is an African-centered talk show in which we correct errors where errors are found. And I like to introduce facts. We'll find that so many people are working on fiction when it comes to who we are as people of African descent. And what I like to do in this show is to introduce historical items and a history that you might not have heard in school that is very important, especially in today's climate of people taking books off shelves and what have you. If you don't understand the history of America, then you won't understand the present moment. And I found an interesting book. Before I came on, you most likely saw a video clip from an author of this book that you see on the screen here, and it's called "The Birth of a White Nation: The Invention of White People and Its Relevance Today," and it's by the author Jacqueline Batalora. I think I'm pronouncing her name correctly. Here's the image of it of the book. Let me give the right there it is. I got my copy. Like every time I talk on this show, it is based on a lot of books that I read. I don't just come with my opinion. Here's a picture of the author, and that video that you found. I hope you found interesting, the little clip that you had. You can see the rest of it. I think it's like about a 45-minute video in total, but she brings up some very interesting points about the invention of whiteness. There was no such thing. I learned this not only from her, but from earlier scholars in my studies over the last 40 years, that there was no such thing as white people until the end of the 1600s, around 1681, like she said in the book, when in law there was placed the term white person, a white woman, a white man. Before that, before 1681, you were French, Italian, English, and Portuguese or whatever. That's what you were looked at. We were still called. Those folks became white by law, and there was a reason, and that's what we're going to be talking about, okay? And the ideology and the mindset that became white supremacy, because if you got in that category of whiteness, you were put above the black people and the native people. But there was a period of time, like always in America, there was opportunities to live the words of all men are created equal. Even in poverty, even in struggle, white and black were struggling, even back then. But then the elites would do their thing, and as she talks about in the video, they couldn't stand what happened after in 76, when Bacon Rebellion came out. That was kind of a turning point out of fear, and those who were in control in England made sure workers did not unite. But here's a little synopsis of the author of this book that you should have: The Invention of White People and Its Relevance Today. This is the second edition, and she's an attorney and a professor of sociology and criminal justice at St. Xavier University in Chicago, and she's also a former Chicago police officer, Jacqueline Batalora. Okay, and this is the book that we're going to be discussing, and the insights that I'm going to share with you when I talk about this topic. Very important. How a world invented in a room still divides the country. Yes, this was not something that came out of any kind of science. It came out of a corporate entity in England, and where they decided what kind of laws that would keep these people from joining forces together, the elites. It's being done today with the 10% and those who push these MAGA Republicans, the corporate entities and the billionaire class. Well, they had them in the 1600s. It's too in England and places like that. In the Virginia colonies and the colonies of Maryland. It was all the elites, the plantation owners. They were the corporations at the time, and they couldn't have the workers united against their harsh treatment because they just wanted profits, okay? Okay, based on the scholarship of Dr. Jacqueline Batalora, W.E.B. Du Bois, Edmund S. Morgan, and Theodore W. Allen. These are some of my other sources. For the last month, or 2 months, I was talking about W.E.B. Du Bois and his great work, Black Reconstruction. And that ties into what I'm talking about. This session with the birth of a white nation, I go back a little further, before the American Revolution, the colonial times, the earliest stages, Jamestown, and what went on, okay, when you had the indentured servants, black and white, okay? And I'm gonna start with this statement. There was a time on this continent, not in misty prehistory, but in the lifetime of people whose names we know and whose documents we still possess. When there were no white people, not in law, not in common speech, not anywhere. And then one day there were. Someone wrote the words down, someone signed it, someone enforced it, and the world we inherited today was made. Okay, and this was in the 1600s, and the proctor even got the date. The first recorded document was 1681. Okay, let's go on. But prior to that, there was no such thing as white people. Okay, here's something no one teaches in school. There was a time in America when the word white did not exist as a legal category for any group of human beings. Not in 1620, not in 1640, not in 1660. The word was not in any colonial statutes in the land. This is not a minor footnote. This is the whole story. To understand how whiteness was invented, because it was invented by specific men in specific rooms in specific years, you first have to understand the world that came before. You have to see what was there before someone decided to change it. And it was for profit margins, and it was out of fear of a combination of the poor coming together, the same fear that we're dealing with to this day of getting black and white workers to work together. What they try to do is separate it. They're doing it now, and it worked now, and it worked back then. Prior to 1681, in those years, and many of us know about 1620, but all those decades up until 1681, there was equality, not in freedom, because indentured servants were not free, but in the fact that white men, black men, Native Americans who were all indentured or enslaved slept in the same room, were under the same kind of horrible conditions, were abused, and a lot of them got together and rose up, and that scared the elites. So they had to find a way to separate them. And one of the first things is to designate the Europeans as white. Let's go on to the next, and let's continue this journey. Go back to the tobacco colonies of Maryland and Virginia in the mid-1600s. Tobacco was the engine of the colonial wealth. It was the oil of that time, okay? It was the wealth maker, the engine. Tobacco was the engine of the colonial wealth, as I said, and it was a brutal engine. It consumed labor the way fire consumed wood, constantly and completely, with no appetite that could be satisfied. The colonial elites, the tobacco lords, the large landowners, the men who had the governor's ear needed bodies in the fields above all else, and there was never enough because of the brutality of the system. One of the hardest crops, tobacco, was required gang labor, and under brutal folks, there were no unions back then. So whether you were a white indentured slave or, well, slave or servant, they use these kind of colloquialism, or you were an African enslaved person, but there were African black indentured servants too, okay, who were under those 7 years or 4 years of contract. And an indentured servant, the word indentured means there was a contract, and there was a dual side, would have all the points of your contract, one side, and there was another side with the same thing, and it was folded in half, and that indentured middle part, as it was torn apart, given to you as the indentured servant and kept by those landowners. But it took gang labor to do that, and tobacco and cotton farms, but at that time it was tobacco, in places like Virginia and Maryland, that was the breadwinner. Let's go on to the next. Okay. So they imported labor from two sources. I don't know if in the video, I can't remember, but she talked about I think in a period of time in the early 1600s, there was a population boom. Demographers who deal with the demographics of populations, they couldn't understand why there was this baby boom during that period of time. But most of the babies came from the poor, low class, especially in England, and definitely in Ireland, and in what we call Scotland today. These poor whites were in abundance. So in the early 1600s, when they started this indentured servitude labor system, they were counting a lot of these folks because they were on the dole in England and they wanted to get rid of these white people. Okay, that was in there. Okay, who were English and majority of them were English men and English women. Then you had Irish and Scots and Portuguese and others at lesser population that were brought over here under this system. Okay, and this was the system between the 1620s and Jamestown and including African slaves and the 1681 when things started changing. We'll talk about what happened a couple of years before that 1681. So they imported labor from two sources. From Britain and Ireland came indentured servants, poor people, often desperate people, who signed contracts for 4 to 7 years of labor in exchange for passage across the Atlantic. They were not enslaved. They had terms and theoretical endpoints, but they were bought, sold, and traded in ways that would shock modern observers. Historian Edmund Morgan, in his landmark study, American Slavery, American Freedom, described the early colonial labor system as a place where human beings of every origin were bought and sold like cattle. That is his phrase, not the author's phrase, like cattle, okay? Not mine, not the author's, but this historian. But how many of you were told that? We were taught that these people came over here like the Pilgrim to look for freedom. No, majority of people that we considered white Americans today, who are their descendants, came as indentured servants, predominantly white men. Okay, let's get that straight. And they were under the same conditions as the enslaved black people and those few blacks who were indentured. There were, thousands of blacks who were indentured too, who also got land when the indentureship came out, but that only lasted for a little while. Okay. All right, so let's go on to the next. This is the history you're not really being told about. From Africa came people who had been kidnapped and sold into bondage in the earliest decades. Their legal status was fluid and contested. Some served terms and obtained freedom, acquired land, even owned servants themselves. But the hardening of life, hereditary slavery was already beginning. Again, prior to 1681, you had enslaved people who was sold and kidnapped. So let's get that straight from 1620. But there were a few or some who got freed, but not many, okay? And they had these early decades, some of them had legal status, and some of them owned indentured servants too, because they were going by the system that was available to them, okay? But again, that did not last long, okay? Just like we had the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act recently for the last 60 years, now all of a sudden, those who are in power, again, the same type of elites, is getting rid of all those things that we had earned and fought and died for since the 1960s. Now it's 2026, and the Supreme Court said that those things are not valid and not needed. But immediately they started getting rid of all those rights. They did the same thing to those black men who earned their freedom, who had the same rights as the Englishman or the Portuguese man who did his indentured time, the ones who survived indentured servitude. Okay, it was a brutal thing. Okay, let's get this again. Let me make that point clear. So it's complicated, but then we'll see where divide and conquer was the name of the game again. Let's go on to the next. Now understand the demographic of these early colonies. Because they mattered more than most textbooks admit, in many Virginia and Maryland counties, there were 8, 10, sometimes 12 men for every woman. Okay, again, that's another dynamic. There were more men than women. When you pack laboring men of every national origin, English, Irish, Scottish, Portuguese, Dutch, Angolan, Congolese, in, in the same tobacco quarters, under the same overseers, eating from the same iron pot, sleeping on the same dirt floor. There is no elaborate social machinery to keep them apart. And in the early decades, this is before 1681 again, there was not one. They worked together. They drank together. They ran away together. They fell in love and built family together. Okay, so even black men at the time married white women. Okay, let's go on to the next. Free Africans in this period, those who got freed because their indentured servitude was out, or one of their masters freed them at their death in their will. This did happen. Again, this is not the rule. Let me get this straight. So I don't want those of you who want to say, well, see, black people own black slaves. Hey, the majority did not, okay? All right? This is early, when America had the opportunity to become one. But again, America did not. Let me make sure I understand. But I'm giving you some of the potentiality of America during colonial time. Okay, free Africans in this period, and there were thousands of them who were free during this period of time. Okay, but that didn't last long, a couple of decades. Held rights that would seem almost unimaginable given what came later. They could vote. They could own land. They could testify in court. They could sue or be sued. They could marry across national and ethnic lines. In one Virginia county, historians have found that roughly half of the free black men were married to European women. Half. This was not scandalous. This was not exceptional. This was Tuesday during that period of time. Again, there was more white women in the colonies than black women or Portuguese women, but or English women, I should say, or before, other than the Portuguese or other nationalities, but there were some, Scottish and Irish. In fact, many of you heard of Benjamin Banneker, okay, the black scientist that wrote letters to Jefferson and what have you, a couple of a century or so later. His grandmother was one of the Irish, or she was Irish or Scottish indentured servitude. She was one of those women that came over here under the indentured. When she did finish her contract, she would give it a plot of land and some seeds, and she had an enslaved man, okay? But she fell in love with that slave man, freed him, and they got married. So that's Benjamin Banneker's grandmother, okay? She was Irish, either Irish indentured or Scottish indentured. She was a white woman, okay? So this is the period of time in her lifetime, in Benjamin Banneker's grandmother's lifetime that we're talking about. After her, by the time his father came into being, that reality was changed by law. So let me get that straight. Go on. Let's go on to the next one. It was just Tuesday. And here's the most important sentence in this entire essay. In that world, there was no law that made a European laborer superior to an African laborer, okay, at that time, before 1681. The line that divided people ran along other borders, free versus enslaved, Christian versus heathen, landed versus landless, master versus servant, but not white versus black. That line did not yet exist in the early 1600s. Which means the color line, the thing we are taught to treat as the oldest and deepest divide in American life, is in fact one of the youngest. It is younger than the first colonial settlement. It is younger than the first tobacco crop. It had to be invented, and we can name the year, the colony, and the kind of men who did that inventing. You're not taught this in school. Let's go on to the next. Before the invention of whiteness, the colonial elite had already begun experimenting with other tools for controlling the laboring population. This was about economics, folks, first, okay? And they would use their own people economically for profit. In 1664, the Maryland General Assembly passed a law that serves as the first serious tremor before the earthquake. I mean, this was the law that started changing the status of black and women marrying black men and all those things. Didn't last long, okay? In 1664. the law was concerned with marriage, specifically with punishing British and other freeborn women, which will be later called white women, who married enslaved men. Okay, again, like I said, it didn't last long. The punishment was severe and deliberately humiliating. If a freeborn woman married an enslaved man or a black man, she would herself be enslaved for the duration of her husband's life. Her children would be enslaved until they turned 30. Okay? Now you see the foundation of these elites creating this divide and conquer by law. Let's go on to the next. Notice that this law is doing and what is not doing. It's trying to use shame and terror to frighten freeborn women away from the marriage that were clearly happening all around the colonies and authorities. Can't have white women marrying all these black persons. It is not using the word white. Not yet. The law still names people the old way, by nation, by birth status, by religion. The racial category has not yet been manufactured. Let's go on. But here is where the story takes a turn that tells you everything about who was really in charge and what they really wanted. The 1664 law backfired. It backfired so badly that it became a scandal because the plantation lords figured out those corporate elites, the 1% again, very quickly that if a freeborn woman married an enslaved man, the woman and all her future children become their property, okay? Profit margin, capitalism. So the masters began to encourage these marriages. They steered freeborn servants women towards enslaved men. But, they held ceremonies on the plantation. Every such marriage increased the slaveholder's human inventory at no additional cost. Okay, this is the insidiousness of capitalism, that it was the foundation of the American system, okay? The land of the free and the home of the brave. No, this is the complexity that you must be taught. The law meant to punish became to expand slavery. In 1664 status was repealed, the 1664 statute was repealed and revised within a generation, okay? But it left something behind. It was the first law on this soil to tie marriage, ancestry, and servitude into a single legal knot. The lawmakers were feeling their way towards something. They had not yet found the right instrument. For that, they needed a catastrophe. And that catastrophe was coming. Let's go on to the next. In the spring and summer of 1676, in the colony of Virginia, nearly came apart from within. The trigger was a man named Nathaniel Bacon, not a peasant, but a freedman and a minor planter with ambitions and grievances. What made Bacon dangerous was not his personality, but his potential allies. He looked around the colonies and found it full of people who had been systematically lied to by the men on top. What else is new? Okay, next one, then I'll stop. Okay, what I think I'm going to do is stop right here. This is the beginning, again, of what we call the Bacon Rebellion. And this was the turning point which gave the people who were controlling the colonies, controlling corporations in England, what Bacon did, and I'll go through it and start with that aspect that frightened the bejeebus out of the ruling class here in America and also the elites in England that made them change, made them decide we're going to divide and conquer these fools. But let me wait until next time. So I hope I gave you a little insight that this is the origin story of America. It's complex, complicated, but it's factual. You could do your own research. Everything I teach and tell, you can find out. But I'm going to leave it right here. Until next time, peace, Hotep.